and I'd just like to do a brief introduction of someone who one can do a very lengthy introduction of, given the number of awards she's got. Arundhathi Subramaniam, award winning poet writing in English with 11 books of poetry in prose, of which 5 are original works of poetry. She's a lyric poet of tremendous gut and mind, restraint and potency, the spirit and material, and interestingly, city and the quiet, and all the very particular spaces in between. So I'd like to invite her in. How are you doing, Arundhati? Where are you joining us from? Do we have Arundhati? I think we'll just get her on. I'll be starting with her most recent work, Love Without a Story, which was published last year. It's an original work of poetry.
Hi, Tisha. Okay, I'm on now, I think.
Yes. Hello.
Hello. Good to see you and good to be a part of this conversation. It's a conversation I'm looking forward to because it actually feels like an extension of a conversation that we started in 2011, which is when I first met you. And since then, though we've met fleetingly, I think we've had fragments of conversation that I've always felt the need to pick up the threads of. So I hope you'll do that today. As for where I am, I'm in Chennai, I'm in Madras, the city that I've written about on occasion. It's not my city, but it's the city where my mother is right now. And that's where I am during lockdown.
Is everyone well at home?
Yes, it's not been entirely free of difficulty. There have been losses, there have been difficult times, but yes, we are good. My mother is well, I'm well. I have a cook at home who's been looking after us wonderfully. I'm very grateful, really. There's a lot to be grateful for. So it's not been without hiccups.
I see. I think we'd also like to sort of thank Team KLF at the outset. This is part of a conversation which has been ongoing. It's called Bhava Samvad. So let me start.
I also
straight up.
point out, Tisha, that when I curated this festival, Mystic Kalinga, a couple of years ago, it's interesting, and that's to bring the team KLF into the picture because they invited me to curate that festival, and it was around Bhakti poetry. And I remember that you made the effort to actually attend that festival. You took a flight from Delhi and turned up at that festival. So there's an interesting convergence at work here.
True. I think Team KLF, thank you for this effort. I want to set up the mahal straight away, Arundhati, for some poetry. So my first question to you, as our messenger between moon and mud, to the audience which is tuning in, these are not my lines. These are lines from her poem Mitti, where she sort of references the poet's role. And the lines actually, I'll read it out, but I'll request her to, of course, recite the poem. I figured that the moon was a likely mud gazer, just as we are moon gazers. And so I uncovered the old role of poets, to be messengers between moon and mud, and the great longing of life to hold and be held. So I wanted to ask you, Arundhati, what Bhav Samvad has nourished you, your reading at this hour of the pandemic? If you'd like to share whatever you've been reading.
It's been eclectic, Tisha, as it often is. I've been reading a lot of Koletkar. I've been reading a lot of the Bhakti poets, as always, returning to Nammalvar, particularly A.K. Ramanujan's wonderful translations in the book Hymns for the Drowning. I've also been working. So I've been doing some amount of work helping Sadhguru with a book that he's doing on karma. And I've been reading a lot of women mystics because that's a subject that interests me more and more, particularly the way in which many of the women poets of the Bhakti tradition in our subcontinent, the way in which they seem to inhabit the body fiercely and the way in which they inhabit the heart fearlessly. That's something that I'm in awe of. And I return to them for that reason.
I think that sort of sets up the base nicely for a question that I did have for you,
Mm-hmm.
which is related around not just your secular poetry, if one can call it that, and also the bhakti translations. Is
Mm-hmm.
that the human body as a vessel of RNA, DNA, immunity is also a centerpiece, not just in our own life mystery right now, but the
Yeah.
body is also a theme which recurs in your poems, whether it be with a lover, a parent, a death, a memory, a taste. So how have you seen this evolve both in your, original works of poetry and some of the bhakti translations? If you'd like to share some thoughts
Mm,
at length on that.
yeah. Maybe it's always auspicious to start with a poem. So maybe I'll just share with you um, a poem by Akka Mahadevi, translated here by A.K. Ramanujan. It's a poem that some of you will be familiar with. Akka Mahadevi being the great Kannada woman mystic, who's known to have actually walked the world naked. And that gives this poem a particular charge, I think, when you keep that in mind. She says, people, male and female, blush when a cloth covering their shame comes loose, when the Lord of lives lives drowned without a face in this world. How can you be modest? When all the world is the eye of the Lord, what can you cover? What can you conceal? That seems like an auspicious note on which to begin. It's always good to start with a poet. And it
Yes,
brings me
yes.
very crucially to this question of the body, I think, which she talks of, uninhibited. What can you cover? What can you conceal? And yet it's amazing, isn't it, how much one can conceal? And I don't just mean in terms of clothing, in terms of the fabrics we choose to wear, some of which are wonderful. I mean really in terms of the many layers by which we conceal ourselves from ourselves. And if there's anything that this pandemic is giving me personally the time for, it is the time to actually look at those layers, the many, many layers that we've sometimes unconsciously, that I have certainly unconsciously um, hidden behind. And to look at those, to enjoy their textures, not just to rip them apart, to enjoy their textures, but still to look at what they mean and why I've needed them and what I'd like to hold on to, but freely, and what I'd like to discard also freely. I think what I found in my life, Tisha, is that as the spiritual journey or my own spiritual practice began to deepen and take root, I found that very paradoxically, perhaps, my poems started getting more sensual, more passionate, more earthy, there was more mythi in them, than ever before. They were sometimes more erotic. And this is the paradox, because I think sometimes one begins to believe, almost all of us believe, I certainly did, that the more spiritual one gets, the more spirituality you want to invite into your life, the more spirit you want to make room for, it's actually, that you will actually be becoming less of the body. You will be less engaged in matters worldly. But in fact, the reverse was true. And that's when I discovered that what begins to happen, if anything, when you find any practice that you make yours, which works for you, is that it actually starts changing inner architecture. So walls start collapsing, ceilings start falling down. I have a line in one of my poems called Confession, um, in which I say, when I open the coffee percolator, my roof flies off. And actually, that felt like what was happening in my life at one point in time. So, what I began to realize is that all the barriers that I had set up, um, the very strong soundproof barriers between body and head and heart, between flesh and spirit, whatever, the inner and the outer, I found those were just getting thinner, more permeable, more porous, and the poems began to talk about that porosity. So when people talk about the spiritual in some into inverted commas, I always feel like saying I'm not sure that I completely understand it in terms of my work. Because if talking about cities and lovers and friends and parents and orange lunchboxes and gods, if all of that in some way adds up to a poetry of the spirit, then yes, I have no problem with it. But really, for me, it's been about acknowledging the inseparability of concrete and abstract, of acknowledging that I am body and more, and acknowledging that more and acknowledging the here and now. I think that for me is really what began to happen. I just felt I was participating much more in my life than I was before, inhabiting more of myself than ever before. And that led me to the Bhakti poets in a new way, because they'd always been part of my life. I mean, they'd offered me consolation at different times in my life, provocation as well. But now they began to speak to me differently because I realized that they speak of the body in this way that we've just seen, in Akka Mahadevi. They're capable of talking of the perishability of the body, but they also speak of the body in the finest poems. They speak of the body as an instrument, a wonderful instrument, a pleasurable instrument of knowing. So, one of my favorite poets, to go back to the Kannada poets, one of my favorite poems is really Devara Dasanaya's 10th century poem, in which he says to his god, his personal god, Ramanatha, he says, "You give me a body, and then you ask me to transcend it. Is that fair? Who set up these rules?" So he tells his god, "You take on a body now, and then let's have this conversation." This is one example among many that remind us that the body in some way has to be acknowledged before it is transcended or transformed. It cannot just be wished away, it cannot be amputated, and it needn't. You
Yeah.
know?
I think there's also another poem of yours which sort of references this in some sort of way where you speak about. I think I'm referring to sharecropping,
Yeah.
where you bring out a very unique sort of head heart shape that is our bond with our own mothers. Both the need to at some point cut the placenta and the recognition of inseparability. Could you tell us, perhaps a little more about how this poem came to be? And also, please do recite it for us because this is on popular demand. I've had several people reach out to me saying that, could Arundhati please recite the poem?
That's
Share.
good to know, and I'm so glad you brought it up because I love the idea of leaping from bhakti to mothers. I just love that because that kind of leap is what excites me about the art of poetry anyway. And the head heart cocktail is what one hopes to whip up in every poem, but is not always successful. I'd say about sharecropping, and I hope I can find it. I think it's in When God is a Traveler. What I'd say about that poem is that my relationship with my mother is probably the closest relationship I've ever had in my life. And I think everyone almost everyone will relate to this on some level. The fact that we grow up with parents as of course, as our caregivers, and frequently that role is reversed towards the end of one's life when one, unfortunately, sometimes has to become caretaker of one's own parent. There is a time when poets are just the backdrop of one's life. And then there is the time, somewhere in between, when you look into a parent's eyes, and I certainly looked into my mother's eyes at one point in my life, and there's a moment of startled recognition, because that's when you realize that you've been spending your life trying hard to be someone else. You don't want to necessarily grow into your parent. But your mother doesn't necessarily want you to grow into her. In fact, she'd rather not. But there's a moment when you suddenly realize, oh my God, you're so much more her than you realized, than you ever perhaps realized you were. You thought you were busy discovering yourself, inventing yourself, reinventing yourself. But in that gaze, you actually feel you're the same person in two different bodies. That's about as close as two physical bodies ever get, I think. Sharecropping. I'm wearing my mother's sari, her blood group, her osteoarthritic knee. We voted for different men, same governments. In dreams, she plays among trees of rubber and beetle palm outside a home in Myanmar, while I scamper down dark service stairways in Bombay buildings, sharp with the smell of urine and kesar agarbatti, smoking out of the pocket of the seventh floor madman. She lusted after Devanand, I after Imran Khan. On television, both still sport headfuls of black hair. She treads nimbly across language. I bow every now and then into mouldering inertias. I come undone with muzak or a compliment. My mother's made of sterner stuff, sowing the same dream in a different self. The cussed logic we both know behind eons of parenting. We talk Buddhism, Lata Mangeshkar, plot pedicures late into the night, and she watches me, ancient peasant, canny harvester, her eyes bright with defeat as I grow stealthily into her body. Here it is then, the treachery of middle age, of love. It gets no closer than this. Mom.
Thank you for reciting that for us. I was watching, to research for this session. I was watching a couple of your interviews, and one of the things that you often say in several of them is that
Hmm.
you've lived your life around questions, not full stops. Wonder rather than certainty, and I'm here trying to quote quite exactly: wonder rather than certainty. So I wanted to ask you, as some sort of a veteran of wonder, how do we see wonder in the here and now? It's a tough time to return to wonder.
It is. I love that phrase, veteran of wonder, and I should remind you to put it in my orbit. Hopefully, I take it soon. But yes, it is quite a phrase. And I wish I could claim to be a veteran of wonder, Tisha, but I think what I am much more of is someone who's constantly trying to reclaim wonder. And, very simply, I'd say that it's about the feeling you have sometimes when you come out of a meditation, or even more simply, the feeling you might have when you open your eyes in the morning, which everyone knows. That sense of openness and a willingness to be surprised. And how does one bring that into one's life, into all one's interactions with the outside? I think that is really the challenge, a certain willingness to be surprised. How do we approach the world with that? Not with naivete, but with that willingness constantly to be surprised, happily surprised. God knows we are very unpleasantly surprised very often. And more today, I think we're surrounded by uncertainty like never before. There's more noise. Strangely enough, there's more noise than ever before. I think, probably the social media is full of it. I'm not on the social media very often, but I know that there is a sense of feeling more dinned against than dinning very often because, television, this, that, everyone's shirling news as well as fake news and all of it. So how then do you navigate your way? I'd say it has to be different for different people. For me, it is about probably something that I said in a poem that I'm not going to read. And I'm going to tell you what that line in the poem was, which I wrote quite recently. It took me by surprise. But then I realized I'd actually been saying this before as well. It hadn't struck me. I said in this poem, this most recent poem, which was in fact published in the Indian Express about a month ago, it's called The World Takes a Breath. And I started by saying the world takes a breath noisily, because I was just experiencing noise all around me and probably within me as well. So it felt like there was a great deal of unease and how was I going to come out of this? And then I said in the poem at one point, I said, meaning won't save us, but rhythms will. And, it's one of those lines that, you find very often that a line is wiser than you are. And then I decided to pluck out that line and say, my God, what am I, where is that leading me? And I realized, in a sense, that's actually what excited me, even in my most recent book about this woman character, Abayar. She's an old woman. She's the centerpiece of that book in some ways. It's a poem called The Fine Art of Aging, where again, she's not looking for meaning. She says in that poem, I say, she's unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. And there again, there's a clue for me that rhythms are in some way the way out of this. There are times with rhythms where you just feel you're obediently following an imposed rhythm. And then there are times when you realize that you're actually aligned with the rhythm, and there is wonderful dance, the jugalbandi that's happening, and things are opening up, And you didn't need meaning for that. You really needed just to find your rhythm. So I'd say that's my challenge in these times. And I think in some ways that resonates with anyone. I'd say that might be the way to do it, to find your rhythm through the day. Sometimes it'll feel like you're just following habitual, repetitive patterns. But then there are moments when that swivels into choreography, and you're the choreographer. That's a great feeling. And it does happen.
Yeah. Sorry. Please continue.
No, that's it really. I'm not sure it addresses the question of wonder, but in some way I think it does, because I spent so much of my life thinking I was looking for the meaning of life. It's taken me this long to figure that actually it's much more about a quest for rhythm, a quest that allows me to inhabit myself joyfully, rhythmically perhaps, but also deeply, fully, and to share that, to be able to share that.
I think I read somewhere on Twitter, I don't know who tweeted it. We're right now in a time where the world is confronting its own emotional addiction to the myth of certainty.
Mm.
There's also we've all sort of settled grooves, and rhythms can sometimes be justified as a sort of an unwillingness to change. And
Yes.
I think I'll ask a question. I had actually a question in mind about the fine art of aging,
Mm.
the poem that you've sort of referenced. That
Mm.
we're also at a moment outside of this pandemic also, when who represents who translates whom is of course both a need, so that more poetry and more work is available to us in all languages, including English. But it is also rife with politics and opinion. So I specifically wanted to ask you about the seven sections of the poem "The Fine Art of Aging," which is from your book "Love Without a Story." What were you attempting in that?
Well, I think on the one hand, there are many preoccupations there that have been preoccupations more recently for me. Aging, for one, growing older. Um, is that someone at the door?
Yeah, no, it's the neighbor's house.
Okay. So there's aging, there's love, there's intimacy, and there's travel, there's quest. I think the poem tries to bring together many of those strands, which are my concerns, which have been recurrent concerns. What I find different about Abayar, let me say this, in the previous book, When God is a Traveler, the central woman in the cycle of poems that was very important to that book was Shakuntala. And I allowed Shakuntala to lead me through those poems in some way, because I found that she just recurred. She was a recurrent image for me. And very often, that image would reduce me to tears, and I didn't know why. So I wanted to follow that image and see where it led me. This has been an image that stayed with me for about 10 years. That's when I started trying to make my peace with Shakuntala. Abayar, in some ways, was similar. The notion of Abayar kept recurring. When something like that happens and you're a writer, you try to follow that lead. You try to see why she's recurring and where this figure, which is a product of your own inner intelligence, pulling you in some direction. You try to figure where that is trying to lead you and why. And I realized that Abhayar, in many ways, is a quester figure, which has been there in my work for a long time. But what's different about Abhayar, and I hope that means something for me, and maybe for some readers, what's different about Abhayar is that she is a quester, but she's not, unlike the traveler in my earlier book, Kartikeya and Shakuntala. Abhayar is not looking for a meaning. She's a traveler because she's a traveler. She's not looking for a point. She enjoys a conversation. She enjoys sharing a fruit. She enjoys laughter. She enjoys sitting around the campfire, the way I see her. But she's not looking for meaning anymore. And that began to interest me, who this woman is who's not looking for some kind of validation outside of her. Who is she? I think that's how that poem unfolded, Tisha. About the politics of it and so on, I don't think I allowed myself to get troubled by that too much. I mean, Abhayar, when I think of it, she's a woman, she's a poet, she's a traveler. The only thing she is that I'm not is that she is dead, and she's a very wise woman. That's reason enough to follow her. I can't claim to speak for her, but I can certainly claim to speak for where I feel she wants to lead me. So it's about following that trail. Does that answer your question or not? Am I not making it problematic enough? Can you hear me?
I think even the for people who have read Love Without a Story, it seems like at the base of that collection is also a sort of air of contentment. You know,
I know more than one person has said that. I don't think I was conscious of it when writing it, but I feel there is. What is that book about? I mean, you never think about that when you're writing the poems, right? They always add up as lots of independent poems. When I look at that book now, when all those poems came together, I realized they were just basically talking about different kinds of intimacy. The intimacy between parent and child, between friends, between lovers. And there is also what we might broadly call spiritual love, if you might call it that, but in very diverse faith contexts. So there is a nameless love that the monk talks about on the road to Mount Kailash. There is the love of this naked woman mystic whom one encounters, the one who talks about her love for a guru who's been dead over 4 centuries. What kind of love is that? There is the love of an unnamed saint of La Verna, which is really St. Francis of Assisi. So I talk about that gentle saint scarred by love. He's a gentle saint of the valley. That's St. Francis of Assisi. There is a trip to Ajmer, which is clearly a reference to the great Khwaja of Ajmer. So you wonder about a mystic who was caught up in a sandstorm of love and what that might mean. So I think it's a curiosity about love of different kinds. And Abhayar encapsulates all of it because, it's all there in those lines of the poem, Tisha, where I say, Abhayar talks about it when she, I say about her. She says, for lovers, flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the world, love without a story. It seems to me that when stories subside, as they do with Abhayar towards the end of her life, she's an old woman, when those stories subside, when those contexts dissolve, when the drama begins to, when the lights begin to come on in some way, the drama subsides as well. I think what you're left with is that. You're left with a gaze that is capable of including more than it leaves out. And that for me is love without a story. So maybe that's where the seeming equipoise of that book comes from. That there is a glimpse of a gaze that is capable of combining intimacy with spaciousness, which is the quest of bhakti, actually. It is the
Yeah.
quest of bhakti.
I mean, I definitely felt while reading it that there was this sort of spirit of repair, certain rejuvenation, which you could call it equipoise, but also an air of contentment without being drab or overcommitted to laziness. Because that's one of the things. The flip sides
Yeah,
of contentment
yeah.
can be that. But yeah, I mean, I think. Bhakti poetry, you mentioned it many times. I wanted to ask you a very sort of specific question. What is it about Bhakti poetry that turns words sung or spoken into these gulps of recognition for you? First as reader, a listener, and then as a translator. So there are several journeys that you're taking here. And if you'd like to shed some light on that.
Gulps of recognition. Nice. I think it's what you actually mentioned earlier, Tisha, and what we talked about, that head-heart combination. The fact that these poets remind us that there is nothing jingoistic about the language of the heart. That the heart, in fact, is a very scary, a very risky address, and yet they inhabit it. Not because they're unafraid, but because it's a conscious choice to inhabit this place of great possibility. And why would they do that? Why do these poets do that? That excites me. I think they do that because they recognize that in some way that space is a space of great wisdom. And bhakti is a place of great intelligence because we are being reminded again and again that there is more at work here than just uncontrolled emotion. What is at work here is something that I call a science. It's the science of intimacy. It's something that works on you, transforms you. And the bhakti poets are, at least their poetry, they testify to that again and again. The fact that they can play around with all the possibilities of intimacy. They can rage at God, swear at God, love God, make love to God, eat their God. They can take every possible liberty with this God, argue with God, of course, complain to God, every liberty, because it's a relationship of love. That's what you do in a relationship of love. Every conceivable toxic, putrid crevice in your consciousness can be shared with this being who is sort of deeper to you and deeper and more intimate with you than anything else, anyone else. So that quality of bhakti poetry, and of course, with that intimacy goes an absolute disregard for hierarchy. That appeals to me as well, I think, particularly as a modern reader. The fact that intimacy always destabilizes hierarchy. So the closer and closer you get in these poems, in the erotic poems, it's closer you're getting to the site of sexual union. But they're always metaphors for mystical union. But the closer you get to that place, hierarchies are always falling all around you. You really don't know, as Annamacharya, the 15th century poet, says, you don't know who the boss is and who's the slave. All the bhakti poets, many of them, remind us of that reciprocity. You are required, you are needed by this God as much as you need her or him. And it's a license, that's the ultimate disregard of hierarchy, that this is a God who invites you to the point when you don't need her anymore. And that's the end of my anthology of bhakti poetry. That wonderful poem by Tukaram, who loves his God, who bargains with his God, who rages at his God, and is also capable of saying at the end, for me, God is dead. And all those are true. And bhakti allows you to acknowledge all those realities. All those are true.
I also wonder, outside of poetry, as a more political question, so many of the bhakti poets in their own lifetime were vilified, by whatever the dominant social structure, or even the conservative hierarchy within priesthoods, or whatever ecclesiastical framework is specific to each.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you sort of confront some of these questions at a time when caste formation is a deeply held reality in India? Whether we acknowledge it overtly, Bhakti itself is such a protest movement against several, whether you want to call them hiccups of access, whether you call them sort of consciously engineered exclusions. So there is also, as the translator, one is the personal space of intimacy that you experience in the actual writing, which is the finite and sometimes the infinite world of expression. But then there is also the societal, the lived. How do you sort of look at some of these observations, questions, just sort of these continue to be live questions?
They continue to, absolutely. And, in a sense, what you're asking is an age old question about does poetry make anything happen? And the answer is no. And yes. Always. No and yes. So even in the book, I try to caution against, looking at these people's lives. And there are short bio notes at the end. But if you were to look for inconsistencies and contradictions, even in their lives, you would find it. And many people always, point out the inconsistencies of bhakti poetry as well. So some of it is, there are all kinds of canonical feuds being worked out as well in these poems. So it is in itself a complex inheritance. So I don't want to, when I say I'm inspired by them, I'm not saying it's because there's some kind of inspirational monolith. I'm saying it's a great, messy, but still deeply emancipatory inheritance. And sometimes we don't even need to think too much about the poet. We can actually draw on the poem. And those poems, I believe, speak to us today, perhaps in a way like never before. I believe they speak to us. That was the reason for the anthology. Does it mean that reading a poem is ever going to change the world? Yes, no. Both are equally true. So what changes the world? I think we're all still trying to figure that out, isn't it? We're still trying to figure out what really changes the world. What I do know is that sometimes reading something, when you encounter a conscious utterance and you encounter it at a certain time in your life, you move on. You may move on to what you think really counts in your life. What really counts varies from person to person. It may be the newspaper that counts in one person's life. It may be a manifesto in someone else's life. It may be a host of different things. People have hierarchies of what matters, reality. But I have found that often encountering a certain conscious utterance, especially when it is a beautiful utterance as well, as poetry often is, when it is a deeply conscious utterance, it's capable of creating all kinds of shifts within you that you're not even aware of at the time. And that is the great transformative potential of song. That is the great transformative potential of art. That is the great transformative potential of poetry. That it is capable of coming and assailing you completely unawares. And I'm holding out for that kind of transformation, which doesn't mean one doesn't engage with life in all the many, on all the levels on which it has to be engaged. There's some kinds of action that might require you to go out on the streets and protest. There are some kinds of situations that might require you to sign a petition. But that doesn't mean that you forego poetry that allows you deep joy and offers you this ability to swivel when that possibility for swiveling happens and you are transformed, I believe in many, many ways, and I'm certainly not the first one saying this, I do believe that in many ways you have an impact on the world. I keep that faith because I know it to be true in my own way. Or I wouldn't be sitting here talking about Tukaram with you. That man, in some way, 4 centuries later, has impelled our conversation. Nammalvar, 10, 11 centuries later, is prompting this conversation. Why is that? You know, if these are not people who've left imprints so deep that they cannot be ignored.
I think for people who are watching, there's on the ticker, you'll see these several sort of links. One of them is, will also lead you, I think, to Eating God, which is an anthology of Bhakti poetry, which Arundhathi has edited. And I think also put together several translators for, right?
Yes,
Even
many of
in
them were existing translations and many were commissioned for the book.
Yeah. I think I want to, using your word, I want to swivel to another area of conversation. Your poetry across the many volumes, and I've read all of them, seem to also mirror a very sort of modern Indian woman discovering herself, at every layer, and the world on her tongue. I wanted to ask you that alongside being a poet, your work as essayist, reviewer, art critic, you also sort of written about dance, curator, translator. Is there something that strings these quite diverse sort of possibilities and interests together?
Maybe what you mentioned earlier, wonder, that probably is at the heart of it. And the fact that, I've often said I grew up with a great love of poetry, but I grew up with a great love of theater and I grew up with a great love of dance. And I've often spoken of poetry as a kind of choreography of language, as kinetic language, because it so deeply connects so effortlessly with the performing arts. So I'd actually say, Tisha, that I've been nourished a great deal by, in fact, perhaps more, by the dancers and theater people and musicians I've known. Than just by writers. I've actually been deeply nourished by these conversations. And one thing led to the other in terms of the roles that you talk about. Journalist, I can't make a living off poetry, so I was writing on the arts. And that was pleasurable because I loved watching dance and theater. And I loved reading books, so writing and reviewing was part of that. Later on, the curatorial work, when Vijaya Mehta asked me to take on Chauraha at the NCPA, the curatorial work was an extension of that, because it was a chance to create the kind of art event that I would like to witness as a Rasika. And the poetry editorship was an extension of that because it was an opportunity to listen to voices that I would love to listen to. So I see them as part of the same continuum. But if I were to say this, I think I'd say this, Tisha, perhaps 2 quick points that I'd like to make. I think in some ways, this is how I look at poetry too. That what you're trying to do is to frame an experience. You're trying to take a snapshot. You're framing a moment in language. And it's a moment of great intensity. It's a moment of great aliveness. And it's a moment of beauty. Beauty can be defined in multiple ways, so I don't want us to get bogged down by that. But it is about intensity, aliveness, and beauty. And I think in many ways, that's what is responsible, whether it's working as editor, whether it's working as translator, whether it's working as curator. It's all about framing. Or even the books that I've done, the Buddha, the book on the Buddha, Sadhguru, and so on. It's all about trying to frame something, someone, some experience that combines these qualities in some way. So that's one part of it. And the other is perhaps what I think poetry does with time. Poetry is an invitation to inhabit this moment very deeply and very fully. And the performing arts are performing that magic all the time because they invite you. Time behaves so differently in a green room Time behaves so differently on stage. Time behaves so differently when the lights are off. That heightened experience. I think all of that is the magic that I'm completely hooked on. That's the reason I can't stay away from theaters very long. And the idea of this pandemic, the fact that it's going to keep us away from green rooms and theaters, that bothers me actually. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, it does. I mean, I think these stringings are quite internal and specific to each creator. Therefore, it's always interesting to ask them directly. But I also wanted to, there are several prompts coming in about wanting you to recite any poem of your choice. But I mean, I also wanted to suggest perhaps a bhakti poem, since we've spoken so much about, the pulls and pushes within and without the bhakti poetry world. If there's a poem that you'd like to recite, also because it links to something that you just said, that the art of the spoken word is sort of returning to its full possibility in a very democratic way right now post the internet. So there's
Yes.
all sorts of, but the pull of the spoken word in, let's say, Hindi, Urdu, in several languages, a Kavi Sammelan tradition, some of that is, continued, whether
Yes.
it's becomes subterranean to media attention, but it's quite alive in the hearts of poetry lovers, of which I consider myself
Yeah.
one. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I'd welcome you to, recite any poem of your choice. And then I have a couple of questions, and we are now, I think the biggest question that has come from audiences is really related to getting you to recite. So let me just hand over, that space.
Since we did Akka Mahadevi at the start, I'm trying to think of an alternative. There are many bhakti poems I could share. One is, there's the Annamacharya poems. I have the book with me. If someone asks me for a particular poem, it makes life so much easier. But let me try this one. Which one? Did you have something in mind?
No. I mean, no. I have a request for you, but I will bring that up later. It's not a bhakti request.
Oh, it's not a bhakti poem. Let me read one of my eternal favorites. It's Nammalvar, the Tamil Vaishnava poet, translated magnificently as always by A.K. Ramanujan. One of my favorite poems because it's one of the most inclusive praise poems that I know. We here, and that man, this man, and that other in between, and that woman, this woman, and that other, whoever, these people and those others in between, this thing, and that other in between, whichever, all things dying, these things, and those others in between, good things, bad things, things that were, things that will be, being all of them. He stands there. That's Nammalvar, and it's a good chance to actually say, for those of you who haven't read Hymns for the Drowning by A.K. Ramanujan, that's a book to own.
I think I do have a request. I would really, really like you to recite to Mitti, since that's what we started with, and then just perhaps.
Mitti. Well,
Or if you want to share something that you've written more recently that is not out there, whatever.
There are a couple of more recent poems. The one that I told you was published by The Express, but I'm going to read Mitti because it's actually threatening to rain here in Chennai. Or it looked like it was. It was cloudy, and it's the right time to read about earth, mud. I long at this point to just be in some very green, forested place with lots of rushing water.
Mm-hmm.
And Mitti is, of course, my Bombay poem, so it's not a rustic or bucolic poem of any kind, but it's Mitti. I was asked by a paper to write about a word that was given to me by a reader, and she gave me the word Mitti, and I'm glad she did. As a child, I ate mud. It tasted of grit and peat and wild churning, and something else that I could never quite find a name for. Later, I became a moon gazer, always squinting through windows, believing freedom was aerial, until I figured that the moon was a likely mud gazer, longing for the thick sludge of gravity, the promiscuous thrill of touch, the license to make, break, remake. And so I uncovered the old role of poets, to be messengers between moon and mud. And I began to uncover the many languages of earth that have nothing to do with nations and atlases, and everything to do with the ways of earwigs, the pilgrim trail of roots, the great longing of life to hold and be held, and the irrepressible human love of naming. Ooze, mire, manure, humus, dirt, silt, mold, loam, soil, slush, clay, shit, mannu, matope, baro, tinen, me, luto, fango, all have their place, I found, in the democracy of tongues. None superior, none untranslatable. All reminders of the anthem of muck of which we are made. Except when June clouds capsize over an Arabian sea and a sleeping city awakens to an ache so singular that for just a moment it could have no name other than that where sound meets scent and a slop of matter meets a slick, lunatic wetness. Mitti. Just that. Nothing else will
I think squinting through windows and an age with no name is kind of what many people in the world might be feeling right now. So I also wanted to just suggest your thoughts on a larger question. When one looks at poetry across centuries, whether it's Keats's own sickness, Dante's great love, Surikant Tripathi Nirala's own string of family losses in the 1918 pandemic, Spanish flu pandemic, or even Marcus Aurelius's meditations, which
Yeah.
sort of also come on the back of epidemics and wars. You actually realize there's quite a wide swathe of poetry that emerges post disease, sickness, with a very real sort of lived tinge of mortality around it,
Yeah.
which is kind of, we are circumferenced by it in this moment. So somehow it seems like the appropriate time to draw from that well as well. And, have you read anything that you would like to recommend that really moved you? Because after that, I'll be happy to go into a rapid fire where anyway we're going to go a little after some of the recommendations that you have for reading
We're going into rapid fire.
after this.
Okay, that's a little alarming. But what I will say is that the book, there are many poets who move me at this time, and I think each one is going to look for something else. But I'm always drawn. The reason I speak of the lyric poet, the lyric poem so much is because this notion of mortality is implicit in lyric poetry. There's always this longing for something and then deep sense of transience. That's part of the DNA of the lyric poem. So many poets. For me, the notion of claustrophobia, of containment of this kind, is something that's playing through my mind in many ways. I'm enjoying it, I'm resigned to it, and at the same I'm enjoying it sometimes, I'm resigned to it at other times, and I desperately have needed poets to show me ways through it. So for me, actually, I've been reading Akhmatova, I've been reading some of Emily Dickinson, poets who understood the idea of spells of either containment, incarceration, or voluntary seclusion, all kinds of things mixed up. And of course, the mystic poets, again and again, mystic poets. So Eating God is full of those, but also I've been reading Hafiz, Daniel Ladinsky's translations of Hafiz. I've been reading I actually feel sometimes one should read widely and read at whim. This is what I remember telling students at almost every poetry workshop I've conducted. Read at whim, because there's a place where you have to go in your bookshelves. Just head there. Allow yourself to head there. Often we don't use that. We keep looking outside for what we ought to be doing, but we actually know where we need to go.
I can tell you that I'm far away from my bookshelf, which is in Haryana, and I'm in Bangalore. I have a Kindled bookshelf, shall we say? That's what that's what I'm accessing. But I do want to do the rapid fire, however much it scares you, because I do think I look forward to some of the the quick thoughts that emerge from it, as against the much more sort of layered sort of contextual conversation that we've just had. So I'm going to run through like perhaps
Have
6 or 7.
Too much, Tisha? I've rambled far too much. Is that why you want to contain me with a rapid fire?
No. I promise not to be a containment zone interviewer. But this is just a rapid fire, because many people had reached out and on KLF's various channels, also wanting to sort of suggest and ask you for some of your thoughts on these things. So I'm going to go quick. It's not going to be it's a rapid fire. So here's the first question. So foraging for words in a time of visual overstimulation, what works for you?
How do I forage? Is that the question?
Whatever works for you.
Oh gosh, what works for me is not foraging too much. Intuitively reaching for the book that it demands to be picked up. Putting down the odd phrase or image when it occurs to you, but not overworking it.
All right. This is also the R of science. I'm sorry, I'm going to go really fast. Otherwise, it would be non-rapid fire. This is also the R of science. Any great scientist poets that you recommend or have read?
Well, Ruth Padel is not a scientist, but I've been reading her recently, and she's the great-granddaughter of Darwin. She writes on, there's a lot of zoology in her poems. Miroslav Holler, the Czech poet.
Sorry?
He was a writer. He was a Miroslav Holler, the Czech poet. He was a doctor, immunologist. Guy Patel, our very own Guy Patel from Mumbai.
Okay.
Okay.
And Indian poets' work writing in a language other than English, which really held your attention recently?
Manglesh Dabral in Hindi, Savitri Rajivan in Malayalam.
Any book of
these
theirs?
Poets were always around me. Their work. I would recommend a lot of their work to be found in the PIW, the Poetry International web, which I used to edit and still do whenever we can find space for an edition. We've run out of funds, but yeah, they're all there. They're both there, and there's an edition due later this year. So,
and a poet from South India who you have perhaps translated recently or not, whose work you wish was more widely read?
Abhaya, not a contemporary poet, but she is someone whose work I'm going back to. Some of her poems. In fact, I'm trying to translate.
So yeah. These were some of the Reco rapid fire questions. There's just one or two questions, and perhaps we could end with a poem because we have touched 6 p.m. Comfort.
We've had a lot of poems. We don't need to end with a poem unless if there's no time.
We can go over by 10 minutes is what I've been informed, so it's not a problem. I do have one or two other questions left in the rapid fires, which I would like to ask you. Something in the universe seems to have, I don't know, what to call it, put our species on hold, like a phone call. So you have sort of suggested some things, a poet's advice on how best to hold on at a time like this, because very conflicting messaging will continue.
I know. I think it's a pause. And the thing with the pause is it's very difficult to inhabit a pause when there's such uncertainty. But that is also a time of great possibility. It's like the moment when you find a dancer poised on stage. There's that moment, or a ballerina, standing on her toes. That moment of great poise in this moment. I think we are all in different ways excited by that. So I'd say think of this as the intermission. The movie's going to start again, but this is a time to direct your own film, write your own script, or just shut up and eat your popcorn. I don't want to sound like I'm trivializing it, but I really think it's a time of possibility when you can change your script if you want.
Yeah, I think broadly a poetic spirit keeps a suspense, towards life alive. Whether it's bhakti, whether it's poetry in general. So I'd be happy if you'd want to read out a poem that you haven't yet sort of published, or something that you've written recently, and perhaps that's something we can end on in this conversation. And like I said, links will continue. They will be available on Kalinga Literary Festival's various social media. So you can read more about her work. This was a conversation which allowed sort of a breadth of introductions on her many interests, along with some references to books that she's written. So yeah, Arundhati, all yours.
I actually wanted to read a poem called The Monk, but because you've asked for something recent, I'm going to read this. But otherwise, I'd have liked to close with The Monk. This is a poem called The News, which is a recent poem. It was written last month and was published again by The Express. The News. Learn something new every day, say the wise ones. And so we try. The news today is that there's no one at the Champs-Élysées. No one at the gateway of India. No one at all in the spice market of Istanbul, the souk at Aleppo. That the great theaters and pulsating green rooms of the world lie plunged in darkness. That pigeons hover like suspended confetti above the piazza of San Marco. That no one's ordering double macchiatos in East Village cafes. That a woman walking back to her village from Telangana died of starvation in a Chhattisgarh forest. Her news, and it isn't particularly new, is that we are always 11 miles away from home.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Team KLF, for putting this together. And I would like to I think life's longing to hold and be held is being severely tested with social distancing. So we all have to come up with our own, ways of coping and of understanding this time. And I hope poetry can be an ally after a session like this for many people who may not be, sort of testing out the spaces in between.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
What I said always, Tisha, that the poem is really an invitation to the pause. And really, at a time like this, when we are inhabiting that pause, a poem can give you a wonderful way to navigate your path through the day, because it is an invitation to a pulsating, throbbing, alive pause. And if we can see this moment as less one of paralysis and more that of pause, conscious pause, I think we'd feel better about it. And poems can open that possibility up.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Not paralysis, but pause. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Really.
Please be
Thank you
well,
so much.
and I hope we can talk again soon.
I hope so. Thank you, KLF, for making this.